everyone. Welcome to the weekly seminar of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. We are delighted today to have Fathi Massoud, who's a professor of politics at UC Santa Cruz, just over a mountain, where he directs the legal studies program. He is also a visiting professor of law at the University of Oxford and is a former CDDRL postdoc. Recently, he received a Guggenheim Fellowship for his research, and he is the author of Law's Fragile State, as well as the book he will be discussing today, Shari'a, Inshallah. So, thank you, Mark.
Awesome, thank you, Didi. Can folks hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. I'm so accustomed to presenting via Zoom, so there's like actually. Just give me a second to get situated. And I hope I'll share my screen, and I hope things are clear on the screen. All right. It's a little fuzzy, so we'll do our best. Okay, so welcome everyone. I do want to thank Didi for inviting me to be here, Amy for organizing and helping get everything going for today's event. I also want to welcome how many of you are the pre or postdoctoral fellows who are here? Okay, so welcome, because we'll be meeting afterwards. I want to welcome you as well. As Didi said, I was a postdoc here in 2008 and 2009. And it's really a pleasure to be back in this community. I want to talk about my research on the ways that people have used religious faith, specifically Islam, to strengthen the rule of law. This work draws from field work that I conducted in the Horn of Africa for my recent book, which is on the table. And if Didi, if you want to pass that around, people want to take a look, that's fine. And I hope that during our conversation, we can bring out some of the implications for other contexts that all of you study, given the important role, as I see it, the important role of religious faith in activism and in lawmaking in Central Asia, across the Africas, across the Americas, here in the US, in the Middle East. So here in the US, when some people think of the politics of religion, they often think about people who invoke religious faith or God to justify violence or extremism or fundamentalism. Al-Qaeda and the September 11th attacks on the United States. The Taliban in Afghanistan instituting a kind of gender apartheid between women and men. In Sri Lanka, some Buddhist monks have invoked religious texts to promote religious nationalism, civil war, and the killing of Muslims. And just last year, extremists carried Bibles and crosses and flags that said Jesus 2020 as they stormed the US Congress to stop the certification of President Joe Biden's election. Now, because of extremism, religion, and especially Sharia, has been denigrated. The Arabic word Sharia is often translated into English as Islamic law, but rather than being a strict legal code, Sharia is more like an ethical code that guides Muslims' behavior. It comes from the Quran and the Hadith. These are two of the holy books in Islam, which means that different people in different places and different times interpret Sharia in different ways. So even though Sharia is sort of divine law, it's interpreted in so many different ways across times and places. I'd be happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, but right now, with few exceptions, many governments and policy analysts, they see Sharia as a tool of dictatorial control, a means for repressive governments to do things like persecute minorities, restrict women's rights, and restrict human rights generally. Nearly all 50 US states have introduced bills banning Sharia. The map you see shows the approximately 200 different anti-Sharia laws introduced across the US. American senators have publicly called Sharia evil and incompatible with American law. And across the pond in Europe, the European Court of Human Rights has two times ruled that Sharia is incompatible with European values and human rights. Even regimes in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other Muslim majority countries have derided Sharia in their own ways. They've imprisoned anti-regime activists and labeled them, quote, stealth jihadis who are seeking Islamic law. Some legal scholars have warned more broadly, not just about Sharia, but about religious faith more generally, that religious faith itself produces a crisis of law in which, quote, the rule of law and the rule of God are on a collision course because religion is a credible threat to the liberal constitutional narrative. So Sharia and religious faith are not only a threat to dictators, but also to modern constitutional values and the rule of law itself. But my question is an empirical one, and it's relevant to the global policies that we design. Can religious faith instead build peace and the rule of law, especially after a period of war? And I traveled to the Horn of Africa to answer this question. Can Sharia limit arbitrary power? And also, more specifically, what does Sharia do for colonial administrators, post-colonial governments, dictators, aid workers, activists on the ground? So this region is labeled the Horn of Africa because map makers thought that it resembled a rhinoceros horn on the map. Now, Somalia is not known for any rule of law or legal order, much less an Islamic legal order. Somalia, which you see here on the map on the left side of the screen, alongside the autonomous Puntland or semi-autonomous Puntland and autonomous Somaliland, this part of the world is probably best known in global policy and media for terrorism, pirates, famine. It was just in the news yesterday because of new drought. And if you remember Black Hawk Down, this was a book and a Hollywood film in the early 2000s about the US military raid on Mogadishu back in 1993 that killed hundreds of Somalis as well as 18 American soldiers. The United States Fund for Peace, a nonprofit NGO, they have labeled Somalia as the first or second most failed or fragile state in the world. And what I found in this context of violence, in this context of fragility or failure, was remarkable. Sharia, religious faith, was thriving as a foundation of social and legal order and as a foundation for peace. Okay, let me tell you a story. I remember meeting with a young lawyer, we'll call him Tayyip, and we met on a dirt path outside of a courthouse, kind of like the courthouse you see in this photo. In the autonomous region of Somaliland. Somaliland is not seen as a country, according to the United Nations. It's seen as a region of northern Somalia. But a few months ago, Somaliland celebrated its 30th anniversary of kind of independence or self-rule or autonomy from the rest of Somalia. They have a separate currency, a separate education system, a separate police, separate military, a separate judiciary. So for all intents and purposes, they're kind of separate, even though most other countries see Somaliland as part of Somalia. And this young man, Tayyip, he was in his 20s, and he was rather sophisticated. We spoke for an hour outside this courthouse about the cases he was arguing in the courts, the United Nations funded legal aid programs that he was a part of. And I thought one day, Tayyip might well become an important official, maybe a president, maybe a senior justice of the Supreme Court, maybe an important United Nations official. And so I asked him, what do you want to do in your life long term? And then he told me he wanted to stop being a lawyer. And I was confused why he would give it all up. And then he said this, I want to be a sheikh. Sheikhs are religious leaders. They preach obedience to God. They use their understanding of Islamic rules to help people do things like resolve disputes over inheritance, theft, injury, divorce. Sheikhs have also done more than that by preaching on YouTube, preaching widely in public and on the radio to help build peace between communities. Now, my point is that Tayyip always wanted the Somali people to have a peaceful state with the rule of law, but he wanted it to be an Islamic state. And Tayyip is not alone. In many parts of the world, Muslims are also saying they want to live in Islamic states. In a recent poll, 99% of Muslims in Afghanistan said they wanted Sharia to be the official law of the land. 89% of Muslims in Palestine, 86% of Muslims in Malaysia, 3/4 of Muslims in Egypt, Thailand, all said the same thing. The survey also found no variation by gender. So Muslim women were just as likely as Muslim men to favor making Sharia the official law. And that's the title of my book. It's based on people like Tayyib in Somaliland and in many other parts of the world who are like him, who are hoping for Sharia, God willing, inshallah. They have submitted to what they see as the will of God in their struggles for peace, justice, national identity, sovereignty, and women's rights. Now, I recognize that not many lawyers in Western countries or law professors in Western countries might take God seriously or God seriously as a solution to violence, let alone Sharia as a solution. But I'm here to tell a different story about Sharia. And in the process, I'll also tell a different story about the rule of law itself as a kind of empire or even a theology in itself. So my main argument to you today is this. People are using religion or religious faith to do what international human rights law ought to be doing, to build peace and a path to the rule of law. So let me repeat what's on the screen because I'm wearing a mask and I hope I can be understood, and also because it's important. Faith in a higher power is guiding people to the rule of law. So people who are fighting dictatorship, people who are fighting repression, they don't just have to look outward to the international community for discursive resources. They don't just have to look outward to international human rights treaties and the United Nations for support and assistance. Those are relevant, but they can also look upward to God, to a higher power. To make this argument that faith in a higher power is guiding people toward the rule of law, I'll do three things in the remainder of my talk today. I'll discuss my methods, I'll discuss the data and evidence for my argument that people are turning to Sharia rather than away from Sharia to build a path to the rule of law. And then I'll discuss the implications of how we understand not only Sharia, but also the rule of law itself as a kind of theology. So let me start with my methods. My research question on Sharia led me to adopt a triangulated methodology: multi-archival research, qualitative interviews, and ethnographic observations. So first, I conducted historical research in libraries and archives in the United Kingdom, as well as in Kenya and in Somaliland. The white page, I'm sorry, it's blurry, the white page at the bottom left-hand side of the screen, but you can see it in the book being passed around. The white page is Appendix B of my book, naming the 14 archives in those 3 countries where I collected historical details. And I'm going to apologize briefly to the people on Zoom right now because I got an internet connection is unstable notification from Zoom.
It looks fine.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, so that's the first method, archival research, primarily in the UK, but also in Somaliland and in Kenya. I also conducted 142 interviews with high-ranking officials, judges, lawyers, religious leaders, aid workers, civil society activists. And the white page you see is the start of Appendix C of my book, which lists or comprises the names of persons using pseudonyms and the places for each of those 142 interviews. The interviews took place primarily in Hargeisa, but also in Nairobi and in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. For personal security reasons, I was not able to travel to Mogadishu. I explained this very early on in the introduction of my book, but I did interview many officials who live and work there, either by telephone or when I met them as we sort of traveled through together in Nairobi and in Hargeisa in Somaliland. And I'd be happy to talk about that more in our discussion. In addition to archival research and interviews, I conducted ethnographic fieldwork in courts and at workshops where international or local aid groups, where they were trying to encourage state law to develop and even to flourish. The photos that you see, again, I'm sorry, they're blurry. The photos you see are of a district court in Somaliland and a workshop on constitutional law and justice. There's one more method that I think is worth mentioning because I spent a year on it. I took leave from my job as a professor entirely from my job, my research, my teaching, everything, to study Islamic, Jewish, and Christian theology. I'm trained as a lawyer and a social scientist, but I knew if I was going to write about God, I had to know something about theology. And I came to this research as part of my career journey to understand law in the most unstable political context. My first book that you see here, and it's also on the table, shows how the building blocks of the rule of law, things like stable governments, courts, law schools, prison systems, all these help build up the structures of the rule of law. But what that book shows is they can also build up the architecture of colonial or authoritarian rule. So after I wrote this book, some of which I actually started when I was a postdoc here at CDDRL, after I wrote the book on the screen, I wanted to learn beyond trying to build state law. What do people do with religious faith, especially pious people? What do they do with their religious faith, and specifically with Sharia? My research reveals the remarkable ways that Somalis have embraced Sharia, which has important lessons for the rule of law, not only in the Horn of Africa, not only for the Somali people, but also potentially in many places where people are pious, including here in the US. I wrote a chapter of my book on how Somalis invoked Sharia to challenge European colonialism, to fight against European colonialism in the early 20th century. But what was interesting is Somalis weren't the only ones invoking Sharia. British colonial officials themselves were invoking Sharia against the Somalis. I found archival records that document how British colonial administrators, who were not Muslims, they used a combination of law and religion to govern. They brought they brought Muslim sheikhs from other countries to teach the Somali people that Islam permits European colonial rule. In other words, in my language, what the British did was they dressed up the rule of law in religious clothes in order to convince people that imperialism was acceptable. And the story from the South, from Italian Somalia, is a similar one. There's a chapter of my book on the government of Mohammed Siad Barre. He was in power over Somalia and Somaliland from 1969 to 1991. He considered himself a socialist, like many African leaders did at the time, but he still used Sharia rhetorically to govern and to maintain a grip on power, just like the colonial administration did before him. The quote you see on the screen is one of many examples of Siad Barre saying publicly that Sharia and socialism are compatible. I think in order to try and get Somalis on board with the legitimacy of his dictatorship. Many of the earliest members of the Somali national movement, this was a kind of rebel group based in northern Somalia at the time that was fighting Siad Barre's dictatorship from the 1980s. And I spoke with a number of these former rebels, and they told me they were guided by a commitment to faith, by a commitment to Sharia that they saw Siad Barre as destroying because he was using it to promote dictatorship. So the Siad Barre government offers an example of how dictators see Sharia both as a source of their authority, but also as a threat that they have to contain and control. But it wasn't just dictators and it wasn't just colonial administrators who used Sharia to rule. These three, I think, quite powerful images show Somalia's parliament back in 2009 approving a national constitution that proclaimed Sharia as the source of law of the land. And you see women and men celebrating this decision to impose Sharia in Somalia after decades of civil war. I spoke with one of the architects of this constitution in Mogadishu, a senior government minister, and he told me he wanted to see an Islamic state rise from Mogadishu's ashes. He said, and I want to quote, the quote's not on the screen, but I'll read you the quote from my interview with him. He said, "The Somali people trust Sharia more than any other law. You have to use Islam to win their hearts and minds and to make the law attractive." So he said, you have to use Islam to make the law attractive. So back in the 1990s, Somalis in Mogadishu had invoked Sharia to build Islamic courts, to expel warlords from power during the vacuum of kind of state power when there was no national government in Mogadishu. So as part of that process, that Sharia would then become the basis 15 years later of constitutional law. Somaliland to the north, in that part of the region, elders also invoked Sharia to write peace deals during the 1990s, to plant democratic roots without much international assistance at all. I wrote a chapter of my book about their commitment to Sharia during their own reconciliation conferences in the 1990s, and again in the 2001 Somaliland Constitution that's actually still in force today in Somaliland. So you see in that top right-hand photo on the screen, it's a photo of women who are rejoicing and clapping and celebrating when Somalia's transitional government made Sharia the official law. Let me tell you about some of the Muslim feminist activists whom I met. So they regularly invoke the sources of Sharia, like verses of the Quran or statements or teachings of the Prophet Muhammad during his lifetime. They regularly invoke the Quran and the Hadith in their struggle against patriarchy. Now, the national constitutions of Somalia and Somaliland, as I mentioned, they both say that Islam or Sharia is the basis of all state law. So some of you might be thinking, well, that's why women are turned to Sharia, because then they can bring constitutional court cases, like what activist groups and advocacy groups do here in the US, like the NAACP, or the National Organization for Women, or the ACLU, or the Council on American and Islamic Relations. The idea is that if Sharia is in the Constitution, then this would enable women to do what legal scholars would call impact litigation, to take cases before the courts in order to create broader social change. Not exactly. When I asked a civil society activist why she works for women's rights, she never said she wanted to bring constitutional court cases, quite the opposite. She said, quote, "I do this because I am Muslim. Every step I take is based on my Islamic religion. It's part of my motivation. If I want to go to my job and have a normal life, it's all based on my Islamic religion." So what were the things women were doing to fight patriarchy, to push for gender equality? They were citing the Quran and the Hadith to support women's health, to support girls' education, young women in sports, or women standing for office, for parliamentary positions. The women activists I met were pious. They were pious, they believed. But I do want to say that they also turned to Sharia because it was practical, it was strategic. When women activists I met talked about human rights as an alternative discourse, they said that people thought they were, quote, promoting an alien agenda from the West. This is a refrain that I'm sure many of you who have worked overseas have heard. Civil society organizations I met talked about human rights with their foreign donors or their foreign associates, but they also told me they couldn't be seen to be supporting international law or international discourses of feminism or women's rights. One woman said simply, "Patriarchy will not end unless we promote how we are all Muslim." Okay, so what you're seeing is a pattern across my historical research. All of these activities, resisting colonialism in the 19th century, fighting dictatorship in the 20th century, building peace and national identity and women's rights in the 21st century. These are very different kinds of activities, but they're all united because they are critical steps toward, or critical steps on the path toward, the rule of law. And my point is that people are taking those steps with God at their sides. Let me spend the last few minutes reflecting on two primary theoretical implications of my work as a legal scholar: building a socio-legal theory of religion and a different understanding of the rule of law as a kind of theology. So kind of uniting these ideas of religion and theology and law. My evidence across 150 years of Somali history shows the ways that people use their faith in a higher power to build a path to the rule of law. I saw firsthand how religion undergirds the law and also how religion facilitates dissent from the law. British colonization imported views of Sharia from Mecca, from Sudan, from other countries, even from London. Post-colonial governments like the dictatorship of Siad Barre that I mentioned, they tried to use and also to stifle the power of religion. And people today continue to use Sharia to further a national identity and also the cause of women's rights. More generally, my findings help me see the remarkable parallels between theology and the rule of law. Okay, so one of the main reasons for the rule of law, there are lots of reasons for the rule of law, but one of the main reasons is to limit arbitrary power, to limit the power of our government officials, to make sure no leader can make arbitrary decisions. And state officials are supposed to limit their power by submitting to the authority of law. But people also submit to the authority of God, not just law. They see God, not themselves, and maybe not the law, they see God as the ultimate source of authority. And law is not endowed in any person, but it's kind of beyond humanity. It's the state's codified rules that dictate the boundaries of our activities of human beings, as human beings. And law is supposed to provide the kind of source legislation for our rights, for human rights. But people also submit to a different higher power, not the authority of law, but the authority of God. God being very much like the law, a higher power that dictates the boundaries of human activity, and who believers see is the source or the source legislation of human rights. So the paradox of the rule of law is very much like the paradox of religion. And that is that law and faith both rely on the operative concept of submission. Submission to entirely non-human entities that we believe can and should set limits on human behavior. So to put it another way, law and faith are two different horizons of the human, created by the human, that also take us beyond the human. So here I am before you, reporting back to you of the inadequacy of purely legal frameworks and rhetoric to capture human agency, human activism, and submission. And the ways that the standard legal interpretations and discourses that I teach every year in my international law courses, that these discourses and interpretations cannot get at the complicated story of what Somali activists have been doing for the last 150 years. So here I am, a lawyer, a professor of international law class. I just finished teaching to 170 students, talking not about the importance of international law or international treaties, but about the importance of God. In my research, I've come to understand how human rights can replace what people see that God wills with what people see that the law wills. When we submit ourselves to human rights law or religious law or both, we conceive ourselves as subjects of a non-human higher power, either the law's will or God's will, divine will. What this means for those of us who care deeply about achieving democracy, promoting development, building the rule of law, the kind of hallmarks of CDDRL, is that we can't just focus our attention on human rights or legal reform or the tools that we learn or that my colleagues and I teach to students. We may have to refocus our lens onto religion and faith. Now, for scholars of religion, for religious activists, this is not new. This is not new. But I'm trained as a human rights lawyer, and it's difficult to tell human rights lawyers and scholars that just as they experience a sense of hope from human rights treaties, the people they want to help may be finding hope in religious faith because they see God as a more meaningful source of justice than human rights itself. So maybe what we need in our global development community is not more law and more legal reform, but potentially more religion and more faith. Or as legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin wrote in the months before his own death, he needed, and I want to quote from Dworkin from his final book, we need a religious attitude to life. We need to believe, even if we don't believe, we still need to believe that we've made something good in the face of death. So thank you. I look forward to your comments, questions about this hope in Sharia, inshallah.
Right, so Frank, Eric, and Nick to start, and then we'll keep going. And if you could introduce yourself first, so Marcos, that would be great. Thank you.
I'm Frank Rubiama, Senior Fellow here at CDRL. So I like the way that you focus on religious law as a potential check on state power as the core of your definition of rule of law. When Eric teaches rule of law, he gives a lot of possible meanings of it, of which this is one, but I think politically that's really critical. But what you don't mention is the institutional dimension of it, which is the separation of the judicial hierarchy from the political hierarchy. And it seems to me that if the major function of the rule of law is actually to limit executive power, it's that separation that's really critical. So I wrestled with this question about where did the rule of law in Europe come from in my Origins of Political Order book. And it seemed to me that the central historical event took place in the 11th century in the struggle between Pope Gregory VII and the Holy Roman Emperor over who had the right to appoint priests and bishops within the Catholic Church. And then Gregory was also the one that resurrected the Justinian Code and set up these law schools to teach what became the civil law. But at the end of the multi-generational struggle, you had the Concordat of Worms that gave the church, the right to this kind of institutional autonomy. And from that point on, through the Protestant Reformation, every ruler in Europe had an independent church. They would try to control the Pope, or they would try to control religious authority. But that was always a kind of institutional constraint on their ability to exercise executive power. And that was completely different from the Eastern Church, where basically state power and religious authority were fused. And I think that was one of the sources of this continuing, authoritarian tendency in Russia and, other countries in that part of Europe. And you don't mention that institutional separation. And I would think that that's really what's critical. Do you actually have a separate ulama, a separate religious hierarchy that can actually exercise some real constraint on whoever is the sheikh or the emir? And that ought to be the measure of the rule of law, because if it's simply the legitimation of, that comes from your belief in God, rulers can use that, to their, they can say, oh, God's on my side, I rule by divine right, and that leads to dictatorship. And so that's not my understanding of what the rule of law really ought to be doing.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. What you're saying is, in order for the core values of the rule of law really to be achieved in a society, there ought to be, and based on the European example you mentioned, there ought to be this separation between religious authority and political authority, between divine authority and a state or human authority. And I won't argue with what you found in Europe, but I will say that for a number of people in the world, that simply can't be the case, because in their minds, politics and religion are so fused that it's impossible for them to separate them in the way that these early Europeans separated them for themselves. And there are some activists I met in Somaliland who do that. So that
But by the way, in Europe, it wasn't a guaranteed outcome. Like I said, in the Eastern Church, you have that complete fusion. There was this argument in early Christian doctrine over the two swords and whether the sword of God is different from the sword of the secular ruler. And many Christians, argued that, they couldn't understand that these could be separated. It's sort of a historical accident that it worked out that way in Europe.
Yeah, and I think that a number of the people who I met are like those people who you mentioned, for whom they don't understand how the sword of God and the sword of maybe society or the state could actually be fundamentally different. And in fact, they feel like the demands placed on them by their beliefs are such that it's impossible to separate the two. I understand, of course, with globalization and increasing communications between lots of societies, it's becoming increasingly likely that people are starting to separate those, but even a lot of the activists I met were quite sophisticated, still firmly believe that one of the potential ways forward is a radical rethink of that, a radical rethink in the sense that there may be a way to allow state leaders to submit to a higher authority of God, such that the state leaders limit their own authority. Now, the examples we've seen are, the ones you're talking about from the Eastern Church, the ones I mentioned from Siad Barre, very clearly the colonial example, where people find divine authority, and of course they want to link themselves to that divine authority, because who's going to argue with that? Like, if I say my power is imbued by God, it's hard for people to argue against that. And I saw in my earlier book, Omar al-Bashir doing that in Sudan. So certainly that happens. But I think a lot of the activists I met want people to really submit to it. They want the strict state leaders' submission to a higher power to be a limit on their authority, such that that allows the activists themselves to use it as a basis for their activism. Like, you are overstepping your boundaries because God wouldn't want this. God wouldn't want this. And a lot of this is happening. So I know, you're thinking about large institutions and states themselves. In the Somali context, a lot of this is happening in like the sort of germination phase. It's happening when women activists go out and meet with like local religious leaders. And they say, we know you have a lot of power in society. And we know you can help people to understand what law means. And you can help state leaders to understand how to limit themselves. You can help society to understand how women's rights ought to be achieved. So that's where they're using this kind of a submission to a higher power as a means for ultimately walking that path, I think. I wonder if, I wonder what things might look like in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years down the road if people continue down this path. If it will look like the Western Church example that you gave from your book, or the Eastern Church example that you gave, or this third example that I'm giving, especially in Islamic Muslim majority contexts. And so what I'm trying to do is introduce this third example where submission to a higher power can potentially, this fusing of religion in the state, which I understand you're saying inevitably potentially leads to bad things. I wonder if this third example might be the way to bring about a kind of more responsive approach to law.
So even though we have plenty of time, we also have tons of people on the list. So I'm going to start pairing questions together. Is that okay? Sure. Taking two at a time. All right, and I'm going to insert myself. So I was wondering if you, and then Eric. So when you started this journey of fieldwork, and I love the deep inductive research that you did and taking a year off to learn theology, what were your initial hypotheses or expectations when you went to the field? Is this what you expected to find, or were you thinking more along the lines of the Chicago Law Review article that you cited? And what happens, I guess this is a continuation of a question you probably get a lot about when religion is used as a pretext, but if we look at our United States Supreme Court or the conservative party in the United States using religious freedom bills to basically advance a secular agenda of the way a society should look under the guise of religious freedom. Obviously, our rule of law is very different from the societies that you're investigating, but how is religion being used to achieve political ends in those cases? And do you think that that is, sort of a way of undermining rule of law?
In which cases though?
Just in the United States. Okay. Eric?
I'm not a good one to twin a question with, but let's begin. Mark, welcome. It's good to see you again. Eric Johnson, I'm at the law school and CBDRL. I've got two sets of questions. The first one, just following on Frank, is when I look around the world in Muslim majority societies and see how religion has been institutionalized, I'm uniformly unimpressed. The Council of Islamic Ideology in Pakistan, the Ministry of Vice and Virtue in Afghanistan, which I've just been kicked out of, There's a long list of really awful institutions that have risen up across the Muslim world in the name of religion, and of course it's perverted. But if you're looking at aggregating up the positive effect of religion, I'd like to see an example of an institution that has done that well across the developing Muslim world. I appreciate what you've seen on the ground in really micro circumstances. I know I can attest to that too, my own experience on the ground. But I think there is a real dilemma in thinking about institutional structures, given the inspiration that you have here. And incidentally, I like this because I don't have a lot to feel positive about these days, but you always have just a little bit more of an optimistic take on things. My second point is a broader point that I think is a real dilemma. That is, who gets to interpret? And I take your point. Sharia was never intended to be a political, construct. It's a moral code. But who gets to interpret? Ijtihad used to be in the domain of really people really knowledgeable about religion, and then that whole scaffolding came crashing down with terrorism over the last several decades, so that anyone feels like they have the authority. It's sort of like a mirror image of what's happened in the collapse of intellectualism on the internet. But so without that, you would think the broadening of those who get to interpret the Quran would be a democratization as such. But it's had sort of an opposite effect of terrorists around the world interpreting the Quran in ways that they would like to. Extremists in every religion have really screwed up this world. And I'd like you to address the interpretation issue. Who gets to do that?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll take these two. Thank you, and nice to see you, Eric. Nice to see you again after many years. So your question is, Didi, about the hypotheses was your first question. So this wasn't something that this wasn't a hypothesis testing sort of study where I came in and had these hypotheses and I wanted to go through and test them systematically, even though I'm trained in political science. I almost adopted more of an anthropological hypothesis generating approach, where I wanted to see the extent to which, because I was cutting against the grain of what I was seeing out there, I simply wanted to see, the extent to which Sharia mattered. So I went in there going to, this would be selection bias, which I think is necessary when you're doing hypothesis generation research. What we would call selection bias and hypothesis testing research is exactly what you have to do in hypothesis generating research. So I did go in to look for Sharia, these places, to talk to people about it, when I went to the archives to scan for the ways that colonial administrators were talking about Muhammadan law or Islam, or Muslim people generally. So that's my first answer to, because as you said, it was so inductive, the research process was so inductive. And then your second question actually leads in a lot to what Eric was saying as well, which is, in terms of, if I understood the second question, it's really around, we have a lot of conservative religious groups in the United States that are like taking hold of the US Supreme Court and changing the way the Republican Party does politics. And that might potentially be undermining the rule of law. That might potentially be undermining the rule of law here. Religion in the United States, maybe because we have a separation of church and state, and people are using religion somehow to kind of bring that back in a way that may ultimately hurt progressive movements, hurt the cause of minorities, persons of color, queer folks. Yes, I agree with all of that. And I also want to say that there are progressive religious movements as well. I mean, there's the kind of Amy Coney Barrett Catholicism, and there's the Joe Biden Catholicism. I mean, there's different kinds of views, in every religious faith, of course. There, just because one wins out at a certain moment in time doesn't mean the other one maybe won't win out. And indeed, the president is a very different kind of Catholic than the newest Chief Justice on the Supreme Court. But yeah, religious faith, and this gets back to the earlier question, religious faith can and does undermine the rule of law. My book is full of examples of the way people use religious faith to undermine the rule of law. But it's equally full of examples of the way people use religious faith to do the opposite. In Israel, Jews are using Hebrew law to say we have to fight for the rights of Palestinians. In the same way that Orthodox Jews are using Hebrew law for different reasons. In India, there's a Hinduization that's happening of the country, but there are some Hindus who are saying, under Hindu law, we need to respect Muslim minorities. And this is true around the world, in the United States with kind of progressive Christian Catholic movements. So I'm trying to just bring that part of the conversation back, just edge it back into our discourse, that there are these debates and disagreements within religious faiths across countries. Judaism, this is true in India with the Hindu nationalism project there. It's true in the US, especially with Christianity. Eric's question around institutionalization and institutions. And this is something I struggle with because you were absolutely right. Whenever religion becomes institutionalized and you name the perfect examples, politics intervenes and it ends up looking awful for the people for whom it shouldn't look awful. For women, for minorities, for religious minorities, for ethnic minorities, for people who live in poverty. So the question is then, can religion or religious faith be institutionalized in such a way that these things don't happen, the things you're talking about? And unfortunately, I mean, I agree with you. I don't have good examples of the institutional project. My book would be a very different one if I was like, look at all these great institutions that are being created with religious faith. As my response earlier to Frank, it's this is the seeds that I think are germinating that possibility. Yeah, I think that's the best I can say, is these are the seeds. I like to see these as, you know, these aren't the large trees of institutions, these are still the seedlings in the ground. But I think it's still important to notice that, to recognize that, to emphasize that. You know, the United Nations is not in the business of religion. I read many, you know, they're not in the business of promoting any particular religious faith. And I would never suggest the United Nations should do that. But there may be a chance for people in the international community to think more broadly about, and I recognize, you know, like UNDP, they have to partner with states, and to promote religion in the course of state development is very tricky, partly because the people in power are probably going to want to stay in power. And so when power intervenes, religion starts to look more messy. But that doesn't mean that people are still planting religious seeds, even though they know that. They know that there's that potential for institutions to look as they always have. But I feel like what they're doing is fighting religion with more religion, as opposed to saying, we need to fight these institutions, Eric, that you're mentioning, with human rights discourse. We need to fight those institutions, Eric, that you're mentioning, with international law and human rights treaties. They're saying, we're meeting you at your level, and we're going to fight at your level using different interpretations, which gets to your second question about ijtihad, which is Islamic word for interpretation. And traditionally, it's reserved to the most extremely educated. I mean, I met Somali sheikhs who refused to believe that they were mujtahids, or people who have the ability to interpret Islam. These people had memorized the Quran from age 7 or 8. They had memorized thousands of pages of the Prophet's teachings, and knew how to interpret it, not only the Prophet's teachings, but also different interpretations since the Prophet's time, since the 6th or 7th century, through to the present, and the different lineages, and they still refused to admit they were mujtahids. And I was like, if you're not a mujtahid, I want to meet one, because you know everything about, you know it all. But the advantage of what you're saying, that, I understand the disadvantages. Now there are terrorist groups that are saying, we're mujtahids. We can interpret Islam to practice extreme punishments, corporal punishments, to kill people who are infidels, and so on. Equally, there are women activists I met who I think they have to be able to say they're mujtahids. They wouldn't. but they have to be able to inch in that direction, because I met women activists who memorized the Quran, thousands of pages of hadith, and knew what they were talking about. So that opening up, that democratization of mujtahid, I understand it leads to the things you're talking about, but it also leads to these other things. And so I'm torn because that democratization leads to a lot of negatives, but it does create these seedlings that I talked about. Sorry, that was a long answer, but yeah.
Thank you. All right, so Nick and then Aisha.
Great. My name is Nick Kuipers. I'm a pre-doctor at CBDRL. And I really enjoyed your talk. My question is, I think, similar to Dee Dee's, which is that your argument, I think, hinges on evidence that comes from very religiously homogenous places. So Somalia is, I think, more than 99% Muslim. But I wonder, how you think about contexts that are still Muslim majority, but have sizable minorities that are more diverse. So you can think of Indonesia and Malaysia here. And my expectation would be that, in those places, if at the moment of independence, leaders infused Sharia into the sort of new legal codes that they were working with, it would have done more to upend order than, I think, sustain it. And so I guess my question is about the sort of scope conditions of your argument. I mean, where should we think about this, working and applying?
Aisha?
Yeah, I mean, my question is kind of similar. Like we know that Islam is a great source to claim rights and justice and equality, but when it comes to really application, in many places it fails. We know that. And you are saying that Somalia is not at the level of institutionalization yet, but you did all that ethnographic work, and I'm really interested to hear, like, for instance, how religiously motivated people discuss diversity or dissent. Can you give some examples? I'm particularly interested in women discussing feminism through religion.
Great, Mark.
Okay, thank you for these questions. Let me take Nick's question first around the scope conditions. Yeah, Somalia is a different kind of place. It's any survey that's done there, I've seen some surveys that say the place is 99% Muslim. My guess is the other 1% either didn't understand the survey or were lying, because the place is essentially it's homogeneous, as you said. So it does yield maybe certain kinds of results. In the conclusion of my book, I do try and gesture in the direction you're heading, which is Somalia is one place, but if I want people to understand what I'm saying beyond the Somali context, people who don't care about Somalia or Somaliland, I want to think about what this looks like in other contexts. So I do, I mentioned some examples already that I talk about in my conclusion. Israel, a religiously heterogeneous place, but also one that relies on religious law in many respects. Religious law is part and parcel of state functioning there. But still there are activists who are using religion, who are using the religion of the majority to protect minority rights, to do the things that you're talking about as well. I gave the example of India, the example of the United States. There are other examples that I write about where, and I wouldn't claim to be an expert on these countries, on the United States or Israel or India or other places, but I do gesture in that direction that this is a possibility for people to think about the ways that this also applies in religiously heterogeneous societies, because I recognize that Somalia is a homogeneous society. But I think even in the heterogeneous societies that I mentioned, the scope conditions would still be there has to be a religion of a majority. And there has to be a pretty pious population, which is why I look at Israel, India, US, Ireland is another example. Yeah. And then your question about, Islam has this, is a source of rights. And like any, the reason we have a Supreme Court in the United States is because laws can be interpreted in different kinds of ways. Laws are written to be bendable, flexible, malleable. And I think religion is very much the same. It is what religious scholars call lived. It is lived, and it is a tradition that shifts over time. Otherwise, I think religions would lose their power, not only in people's minds, but also in societies, if they didn't if they couldn't be molded and shifted And so your question is really around, well, how do women do that? How do women remold, shift religion and discuss feminism in religious, discuss religion in a feminist context? I hinted at this a little bit in the talk, or I think it was in one of my answers to the questions. One of the things that women activists I met were doing, they know sheikhs, religious leaders, are really important in society, sometimes even more important than state officials. You know, if a sheikh says something, it goes, people will follow it. And so the sheikhs are really, really important. Maybe this gets back to the homogenous society. And so women were setting up, much like in this room, like seminars, discussions for the sheikhs. So the men would be sitting around the table, having the religious leaders. The women would be like where Eric is and kind of where all of you are in the back, just kind of watching, even though they're setting it up. And they would bring in these sheikhs to have a debate over women's rights, to talk about things like child marriage, forced marriage. And they would share with the sheikhs these stories of, harrowing stories of, a young girl whose pelvis was shattered in childbirth was one of the stories I remember. Because she was forced into a marriage at a very young age. And they would share these stories with sheikhs and then kind of guide the sheikhs towards remembering that Islam says that Islam demands bodily integrity, that the Prophet Muhammad talked about bodily integrity, talked about the importance of health, of cleaning your body, of taking care of your body, of seeing your body as a thing to be cared for. And so to slowly kind of guide the sheikhs in that direction towards more feminist interpretations, to ban things like female genital mutilation or female genital cutting, to ban things like forced marriage. So the sheikhs themselves say, you shouldn't do these practices that are widespread in Somalia. And around the table, the sheikhs say, yes, 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 you're right. But then this gets to Eric's point earlier. Once you try and scale that up, that's where it hits the stumbling blocks. And I think that's like maybe my next book, or so like the stumbling blocks start not when the women are meeting with the sheikhs around the table. They start when the women then encourage the sheikhs to take that message out. And the sheikhs say, no, we can't do that. We can't say that publicly. We can't say publicly that female genital mutilation, which of course everyone knows is not talked about like anywhere in the Quran, is not Islamic. They refuse, they'll say it in the rooms with the women present, but they won't say it publicly. And I think that gets to the point of like institutionalization, power, wanting to hold on to power, and those kinds of things. So that's one way to get into the kind of, I think you wanted me to get in kind of ethnographic weeds, one way where a lot of women activists were trying to get the sort of culture to change by bringing the change agents literally to the table.
All right, Catherine, and then Marcel.
So thanks, Mark, and it's good to see you again. We look older, but you don't, of course. It's me. Great talk and really interesting and thought-provoking, and some of the questions I would have been asked already, so I won't repeat the interpretation and who gets to interpret, because when you think about rights and why the women sit on the outside, I mean, who says that's okay, right? So, I mean, it's overlaid with culture, of course, which gets to my question, which is, I think, a theme that keeps coming up, which is even within states that ostensibly have the same religion. So you can think of, Israel and Indonesia was brought up, and Somalia. There are still different disagreements within those religions, right? And so, you have Sephardic versus Ashkenazi Jews, and then Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative. And I know my Jewish relatives always like to say, if you want 6 opinions on an issue, bring in 8 Jews, and you'll get, or actually, I guess it's the reverse. 8 opinions, bring in 6 Jews, because you'll get a lot more disagreement than agreement. So what interpretation of Sharia or Islam would this serve? I mean, is it Sunni or Shia? And doesn't there basically, I'm sitting here puzzling, thinking, basically there has to be an agreement on what is a good society, right? And what is justice. And it seems as though culture is laid on top of that as well. So what you just said was female genital mutilations nowhere in the Quran. Well, yet it still exists in Somalia. So, you know, they have to fight culture and religion at the same time. And not all societies, even though they have the same religion, are actually culturally consistent. And so religion doesn't really help in that sense. Or Sharia would face the same obstacles that a religiously based state might face. In other words, homogeneity is not necessarily what you're saying it is. Just because some place calls itself Islamic, Afghanistan was wildly different than Indonesia, for example, right? So I just wonder if it's actually the homogen. It can bring people together in terms of what is a good society. And this is how we should live in the way that civil law kind of does, right? We all agree murder's bad, but murder of an infidel might not be bad.
So let's, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, kind of convoluted way to say something probably pretty simple.
Marcel had to leave, so Hisham.
Hi, Mark. I'm Hisham Sajjad. I work here at CBRL. And thank you so much for your presentation. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. And so your presentation seems to sort of oscillate between those two narratives, two different stories. And I was hoping maybe you can kind of shed some light on which story is the book trying to shed some light on. And so I feel like on the one hand, there's this institutions focused story about shari'a. So the shari'a as an institution, as you know, a system of laws that could have this liberationary, democratizing potential in various peace building potential, which is very much consistent kind of with what we've been hearing from Islamic studies and also people who are working on Islamic renewal and Islamic feminism. But on the other hand, I hear this other kind of competing story that has less to do with Sharia as an institution and more about the role of faith at the individual level. And the individual kind of level is I think where the is kind of the operative part of that phrase, in the sense that it almost has this neo-Tocquevillian connotation, specifically like book 3 of Democracy in America about the role of religion and how it's helping democracy. You seem to be kind of suggesting that this is not really about Sharia as an institution, but about the role of faith as an incentive for accepting self-limitations, or as something that once people accept it at the individual level, it actually prevents all of these excesses that may lead to conflict, excesses that may lead to authoritarian tendencies, et cetera, et cetera. So on the one hand, I feel like maybe the story is not about Sharia, but it's really about faith, and maybe not about Islam. It's actually more about faith. And I was wondering if you can shed a little bit of light about where the story is. It's about kind of the individual level acceptance of faith and religion and the implications that has for kind of macro social phenomena that we're interested in, peacemaking, democratization, or is this about Sharia as a project, and this is where the explanatory power is in the story when we're talking about Somalia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for these two questions. I'll start with Catherine. And you brought up this kind of relationship between religion and culture, and that sometimes culture is doing more of the work maybe than religion is doing in a lot of these places, including in what I found. Certainly that's what a lot of the feminist activists I met were trying to argue. They wouldn't tell a sheikh to a sheikh's face, like, you're wrong in your interpretation of Islam. What they try and say is, you're interpreting Islam through Somali culture, and that's where the problem is, because Islam doesn't say anything about. So culture is certainly important, because these are legally plural societies. There's customary law, there's religious law, and there's state law. And in that kind of context, I think what a lot of people are trying to say, this gets back to the earliest point we made with Frank around people kind of usurping religion or making the religion the basis of the society, like for dictatorial tendencies, is people are saying it is ultimately, if you step back and see this at a macro level, Islam becomes whatever people want it to be. It's almost like a term democracy. It's like whatever people want it to be. It becomes this really diffuse term that has a lot of different meanings that people imbue in it because of the culture. There's a scholar, I think by the name of Ida Oren, who wrote this book a number of years ago in political science, that people's understandings of democracy in the US change depending on US foreign policy and how US foreign policy relates to certain countries. And so our American understandings of democracy change because of cultures, the meaning of law. And in this case, what I'm trying to show is the meaning of religion itself changes, I think, because of culture. But yes, you're right. Women are fighting, at some level, they are fighting cultural interpretations of religion that male religious leaders who have usurped authority by kind of labeling themselves as the legitimate mujtahids, the legitimate interpreters of Islam. I don't think the women who I met, at least, are fighting against Islam per se as much as they're fighting against those particular interpretations that they then say are rooted in culture. There's more I can say on that, but I want to get to Hisham's question as well on these two stories. And I want to say it's both. I want to say you're right. You picked up on something important, that the book, and even my own thinking about this project over the years, is between, it's actually three stories. It's the two you mentioned as well as a third one. So the two you mentioned, it is this kind of institution, or not institutional, but rather a kind of systemic story of Sharia's potential for peace building and democratization. And I try and tell that story of the potential via the second story that you mentioned, which was the role of faith in sort of encouraging kind of self-limitation, as you put it. It can prevent excesses if people have that if they really believe in that process of submission, it can result in these in a tempering of power and a moderation of these excesses. And I think I am telling the story at those two levels. Maybe for me as a legal scholar, there's a third level that is almost, and I didn't really, the way I gave the talk, it doesn't really touch on this, but to me, the real heart of this project is not necessarily, as I think you picked up on, and not necessarily on religion and the uses of religion for these broader purposes that we often don't talk about in global policy circles, but also the ways that people talk about and use the rule of law with imbuing it with a sort of faith, that there is a faith that the rule of law, there is a kind of theology to the rule of law itself, that there is a parallel form of faith. There are these two kind of competing faiths, one in the rule of law, and one that's rooted in this kind of rule of law, one that's rooted in this kind of religious or God-based vision for society. And that's kind of the heart of what I'm trying to show. That as much as we think Sharia is this rigid system of laws, as you talked about it, I try and deconstruct that and say, no, it's not at all. And neither is the rule of law. And both are capable of good, and both are also capable of empire. And that's what I'm trying, that's kind of the heart of where I build in the book project.
Right, in our final few minutes, the final two questions, apologies if I didn't get to you, these are the hands that I saw, Dinsha and Johannes.
Thanks. I'm Dinsha. In addition to being a former CDDRL postdoc, I'm the local religion teacher for my community, a Sunday school teacher. So I like anything that focuses on religion. But let me push back a little bit on one element. I think part of you mentioned just in your response right now, global policymakers aren't really engaging in religion. You pointed out that people who seek to advance human rights, state building, could get a lot more traction if they engaged in religion. I just want to understand that a little bit more, because my understanding is, for instance, when the US goes into Afghanistan, Iraq, it's not a whole-scale rejection of Islam there. They are trying to engage in it. When we go into Japan, right, we don't get rid of the emperor. We try to engage control of how the implement works. So what would you like to see specifically, or more specifically, in terms of how international communities should be engaging in religion?
Johannes?
Well, I think, yeah, I'm a visiting scholar here, coming from Germany, and that means coming from a country where the problems between different religions really have played a key role. I mean, the most brutal war, was a religious war. The 30 Years' War, 1/3 of the population died. So, and the experience, I think, in Europe is that we have seen that everybody, I think, makes reference to God. And this is very difficult, I think, later on, I think, to make sure that certain principal rules are really respected if everybody, I think, is making reference to God. The dictator is making reference to God, I don't know, the mayor is making a reference to God, everybody's doing that. So, and that is clear because faith is something between God and yourself. And I think it is extremely difficult now from this kind of personal relationship to derive now rules, I think, which have at the end of the day nothing to do with the relationship between you personally and God. God is something which is outside of our control. God by definition is something what we cannot finally understand. So that was the reason why in Europe, if you look over centuries, many centuries, the people said, okay, God is important, the faith, of course, as an underlying, I think, force and drive. But it is not something you can instrumentalize, for your everyday life. God is on my side. We have seen that so often in Europe. And that is the reason why these civil society developed. And a major characteristic of the civil society is it's a rule of law, so that everybody can live with it. So that is really a fundamental difference. And I would be looking on not just a short time, 2,000 years of European history. I would be extremely pessimistic, and I don't believe that this is this mixture of faith and God and our everyday life and putting that on the same level as a setting of rules which we have developed seems to me extremely difficult, and we have not been very successful with this in 2,000 years of European history.
Great, let's give Mark a minute to respond.
A minute, oh my gosh, okay. So thank you for your first question. So you asked the $10 million question is how can global policymakers, what can they do? How can they engage with religion? What would it look like? I think the starting point is that religion becomes a partner and not a problem. And that was with a number of international lawyers who helped develop the Somali constitution. And I'm sure Eric knows this from Afghanistan, when the local leaders want to say Islam is the basis of all state law, and then there's sort of this like rumbling that happens, like what does that mean when it becomes this essentially an Islamic state? So the starting point is that religion is maybe not a problem, but also potentially a partner. The other thing I would say is, especially for the UN Development Program that does a lot of this work on the ground, even though, and I mentioned this earlier, even though it has to partner with states, I think it would be sticking their neck out a little more and thinking more clearly about how do we partner with women's rights groups? How do we partner with these other very local organizations? How do we assist their work in a way that we're not doing already? And I get it, it's hard because the institutional structures in the UN are such that someone becomes a resident representative of a country for a year or 2 years, then they move to another country, and then you're a program manager, and then you're a resident. There's just, it's hard institutionally to develop that kind of structure, but I think part of it is, I don't know, maybe there needs to be sabbaticals for UN officials so they can create more space to step back, to think more about how to stick their necks out a little more in the context of this large-scale bureaucracy, to do some more of the deep dive, while not also doing what I said earlier, just sort of getting wholly into the business of promoting religions, because that's what colonial administrators did. So there are these difficulties and challenges. So maybe it's just sticking their necks out a little more, or seeing religion as a partner rather than a problem. That's a starting point. So I can't give you the kind of $10 million answer, other than the starting point for it, as I see it. The last question is around the experiences from Europe, where everyone is making references to God. So how do we do this because it's so personal? I wonder if the personal relationships can be a start. I mean, I want to recall Eleanor Ostrom and her book, Governing the Commons, where, there's the idea of the tragedy of the commons, where if you leave human beings to whatever they are going to do, life is going to be short and nasty and brutish, and resources are going to be exploited and the world is going to end. But Ostrom won a Nobel Prize saying, no, that's not the case. If you leave human beings to their own devices, sometimes good things can happen. Resources can be managed, not exploited. The environment can be cared for. Communities can, manage their own affairs. The people I've met, they don't need a Nobel Prize to know this. They know this can happen because they live it every day, just like Ostrom found in her own research. So in many ways, my book kind of draws from that example. Even though I'm not going against what you're saying, I agree that in that particular context, that's what's happened, but there are these other spaces and ways. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. What a great presentation.